They told us the forest could not be entered, and for 9 years we believed them. For 9 years we buried our dead in shallow rows behind the chapel, because the deep ground belonged to something else. My name is Halden Moss. I was the constable of a colony called Pell's Crossing. On a world the surveyors had named Therasophore, and the settlers had renamed Mercy, because mercy was the one thing it would not give us. We were 3,000 souls when the dropships left. We were 1,141 when I stood at the tree line with a rifle that wouldn't be enough and decided to go in anyway. The thing in the woods had no name. The colonists called it the Hound, because the first man who saw it said it moved like a dog the size of a draft animal, low to the ground, shoulders rolling, head down. He died 3 nights later, with his throat open so cleanly that the medic thought at first he'd been cut with a blade. The blade theory died when the second body came in, and then the fourth, and then the family of 6 who'd built their cabin too close to the river. The coalition had warned us, in the small print of the colonization charter, that Theris IV carried what they called residual biological assets from a prior tenancy. They meant the Vex, the species that had terraformed this world, and then abandoned it 2,000 years before we arrived. The Vex had been gardeners of a kind. They had seeded their colonies with what their texts called wardens. Engineered predators that culled whatever the planet's ecosystem decided was excess. The coalition's biologists had assured us the wardens were extinct. They were not extinct. I learned that the first time I saw the Hound on a wet evening in the 3rd autumn when I'd been called out to the Brennan farm to look at a dead steer. The steer was not the only thing dead. Tomas Brennan was in the corn, was left of him, and his boy Eli was missing entirely. I stood in the dimming light with my rifle in my hands, and I felt the air change, the way air changes before a storm, but lower in your stomach. And I looked up and saw it watching me from the edge of the corn. It was not a dog. It was not anything. It had the proportion of a large predator, yes, but the proportion was wrong in the way nothing on earth was wrong. The head was too long, the jaw hinged too far back, and there were no eyes I could see, only a row of small, dark indentations along the brow ridge that I learned later were thermal pits, the same kind a pit viper has, reading at a distance and a resolution no pit viper ever dreamed of. Its hide was the color of wet bark, and the bark was wet, and it stood absolutely still and watched me, and I understood with a clarity I have never had about anything else that I was not going to shoot it. Not that night, not with that rifle, not at all. It turned its head, slowly, and walked back into the corn. I found Eli Brennan in the ditch behind the silo. He was alive. He could not speak for 2 weeks. That was the year we built the wall. The wall did nothing, of course. The Hound did not care about walls. It went under them, where the irrigation pipes ran, or it went over them, where the old growth leaned in. It took the Petrov twins from inside their own barn. It took Father Helio out of his garden in broad daylight, and the only thing it left was his rosary. The wooden beads scattered in a pattern that the children whispered looked like writing. They were 6 years old. They didn't know what writing was. But I looked at the beads too, and I saw what they saw, and that night I dreamed of a long tongue moving across a flat tooth, shaping a sound my mouth could not make. We sent word to the coalition. The coalition sent a survey team. The survey team sent back a report. The report said the warden, they capitalized the W now, as if naming it conferred control, was a single individual very old, with a hunting range of approximately 400 square kilometers, centered on a topographical feature called the Sunken Wood. The report recommended that we abandon Pell's Crossing. The coalition would not pay for evacuation. The coalition pointed to the small print. I read the small print. I read it sitting at my kitchen table, with my wife Asha across from me and our daughter Erie asleep in the next room, and the wind making the shutters tap, and, outside in the dark, something was moving along the perimeter that the dogs would not bark at, because the dogs knew better. I read the small print twice, and then I put the paper down and I said, "We have to kill it." Asha did not look up from her cup. She said, "I know." She was a xenobiologist before she was a farmer's wife. She had worked on Vex texts for the coalition for 11 years before we came out here, for something simpler. She knew more about the warden than the survey team did. She had read the originals, she said, and they had read translations. She said, "Halden, The Vex bred these things to hunt their own kind. The Vex were 6 meters tall and had bone plate armor. Whatever you bring against it has to assume the thing in the woods was designed to kill. Something a great deal harder to kill than you. I said, I know. She said, then why? I said, because nobody else will. She put her hand on top of mine. She did not say, be careful. She did not say, come back to me. She said, then we plan it properly. That was the night the hunt began. Not in the woods. At the kitchen table. We had 9 months before winter would freeze the sunken wood and force the warden into closer ranges, which the survey team had flagged in red, which meant the colony would lose perhaps 200 more people. 9 months to learn what we were hunting. 9 months to build what would kill it. We worked in the kitchen. Not the constable's office, and which had maps and good light and a desk made for the work. The kitchen, because the kitchen had Erie's drawings on the wall, and the kitchen had the smell of bread. And we needed to be reminded, every time we sat down, what we were doing it for. I have known men who plan a thing like this in a room without windows. I think those men are the men who do not come home. I sat at the kitchen table with my back to the stove, and Asha sat across from me with her back to the window, and Icy sat on the floor between us with her carving, and the work got done in the spaces between the bread and the carving and the wind in the shutters. Asha worked on the biology. She had a fragment of Vex husbandry text, half a page, half translated, that referenced the warden's metabolic cycle. The warden was warm-blooded, but its warmth was banked, ran cold for days at a time, and then surged when it hunted, a furnace stoked from inside. It thermoregulated through the pits in its brow and through a row of vents along its underside that we had never seen because nobody who got close enough to see them lived. It hunted by heat, but its own heat was the problem its biology was built around. It could not run hot for long. Pursuit warden was a warden in deficit. That was the first thing we knew. Make it run. The second thing we knew was harder to use. Asha translated the word the Vex texts used for the warden's pack behavior, which was unusual because there were no packs. The wardens were solitary, always. But the texts kept using a word that the coalition translators had rendered as echo. It took Asha 3 weeks to figure out that the word didn't mean packmate. It meant the warden's own previous self. The warden remembered. Turned to places it had killed before. It learned individual prey. It had favorites. It was, in some sense, the coalition biologist had refused to credit a person. Asha said this to me with her face very still, and I understood that she was telling me the worst news she had. Because a person can be reasoned about, and a person can be predicted. Person who has spent 2,000 years hunting on the same ground is not a person you outsmart by being clever for an afternoon. I said, then we make it angry, she said. It will be angry. It is already angry. Halden, it knows you. I asked her what she meant. She said, the night of the Brennan farm, you looked at it. It looked at you, it let you live. That isn't mercy, Sri, it's interest. You are on its list. You have been on its list for 6 years. I sat for a long time with that, then I said, good. Then it will come. Spent the winter and the spring building tools. Not weapons. I had weapons, and weapons were not the problem. The problem was reach. The warden moved in territory it had memorized for 2,000 years. I had a map drawn by men who'd flown over it in a survey skimmer for 3 days. The warden could find me in the dark by the heat in my chest. I could not find it at all. So I built tools that would even the ground. I built a sled, low and quiet, on greased runners. Because I would not be able to walk into the sunken wood and walk out again. I would have to drag what I needed and drag what I killed, if I killed anything. And the sled had to leave no scent the warden could follow back to me. I packed the runners with packed clay from the river and dressed the load with bark from trees the warden's own kind had planted. And Asha said this was the kind of small obsessive thing that wouldn't matter. And I said the small obsessive things were the only things that would matter. I built 3 cold caches, small steel boxes, buried under stone, in a triangle around what we believed was the warden's central denning ground. Each cache held a thermal lure, a chemical heater that could simulate the heat signature of a living human body for up to 40 minutes. The lures were Asha's design. She'd worked out the surface temperature, the rate of heat decay, the convective signature of breath, all of it. She had built 9 prototypes and tested them against an old coalition thermal scope. and the ninth one had fooled her. She said if it fooled her, it would fool the hound for 10 seconds, maybe 15, and that was all we needed. I built a fourth tool, and this one I did not tell Asha about, because she would have argued, and I did not want to argue. I built a tether, a long line of high-tension cable, anchored at one end to the base of a Vex root tower we'd surveyed near the south edge of the sunken wood. The other end terminated in a steel cuff. The cuff was sized for my wrist. I would not be running from the warden. There would be no point. The warden ran faster than anything. With legs had a right to run. I would be standing my ground. Tether was not to hold me in place. I would hold myself in place. The tether was so that whatever happened to me, body could be pulled out of the sunken wood, and Eerie would have something to bury. This is the part I have not told anyone until now. The day before I went in, I sat on the porch with Eerie. She was 7 that year. She had her mother's hands. She was working on a small carving, a figure of an animal, with a knife I had given her on her 6th birthday. I'd told her, when I gave it to her, that a knife is not a weapon. A knife is a tool that you use to make other things. A weapon is what a tool becomes when you've run out of ideas. She had remembered the words better than I had, and she repeated them back to me sometimes, and she had not yet had occasion to need them. She said, "Pa, what are you making in the woods?" I said. "I'm not making anything, sweetheart. I'm taking something apart." She thought about that. Then she said, "Is it bigger than you?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Is it smarter than you?" I said, "In some ways." She said, "Then how will you do it?" I said, "I'm going to make it tired." She nodded, in that solemn way children nod when they're filing something away to think about later, and she went back to her carving. After a while she held it up. It was a small, lopsided rendering of a man with a long pole over one shoulder. Not a rifle. A pole. "Who is that?" And she said, "That's you, you're walking home." I put the carving in my breast pocket the next morning, against my heart, and I went into the sunken wood. The sunken wood was not a forest. It was the ruin of a forest that had been a Vexus installation before it had been a forest. And the trees grew up through the lattice of what the Vex had left behind, and the result was a structure. There is no better word for it, that had the patience of geology and the intention of a workshop. The trunks were too evenly spaced. The canopy was too low. The light that came through was the color of weak tea. The ground was soft with 2,000 years of leaf fall and bone meal. And the bone meal was not all animal. The Vex had buried their own dead here, and the warden had buried what the warden killed. And there were places where the soil pushed up against the soles of my boots in ways that suggested it did not want me to be standing on it. I walked for 2 days. I slept in the sled, under a tarp impregnated with the same bark resin I had packed the runners in. I did not light a fire. I ate cold. I drank from a flask I had filled with creek water before crossing the tree line, and when the flask was empty, I drank from depressions in the Vex stonework that collected rain and tasted of iron and patience. I did not see the warden. I felt it. You feel a watching presence the way you feel a draft in a closed room. You know it shouldn't be there, and you turn, and there is nothing, and you go on, and the feeling does not leave. I had it for 2 days. The second night, I ass up against the sled and put my hand on my rifle and stared into the dark. And somewhere out beyond the third row of trunks, something exhaled, and I heard the exhale rise and break the way breath breaks when a creature is settling into a long considered wait. I said out loud in the dark, "I'm here." I do not know why I said it. I am not a man who talks to the dark, but I said it, and the dark did not answer. And I sat for a while with my hand around Eerie's carving in my breast pocket, feeling the small ridges of the work she had done with a knife I had told her was not a weapon. The wood was warmer than the air. I had not expected that. I held it until my hands stopped shaking. Then I did something I had not planned to do, and I have not told anyone about, until now. I hummed. It was a tune my mother used to sing when she was working a difficult animal, a slow, 4-note thing in a minor key, the kind of song you sing, not because the animal understands the song, but because the singing slows your own breath. And an animal can read a slow breath the way a man reads a friendly face. I hummed it through closed lips. I hummed it until the tune ran out, and then I hummed it again. And somewhere out, beyond the third row of trunks, the long, considered breathing went very still, as if whatever was listening had not heard a 4-note tune in 2,000 years and was filing it away. I lay back on the sled and I closed my eyes and I slept. And I did not expect to sleep, but I did. And when I woke at first light, there was a single footprint in the leaf mold 2 meters from the sled. And the print was the size of a dinner plate, and the claws had touched the canvas of my tarp, very gently as if to see what it was made of. I was on the list. The list had not forgotten me. The third day I placed the caches. I worked slowly. I worked without speaking. I set the first lure at a Vex root tower near a kill site. Asha had identified in the survey data a place where the warden had taken 3 colonists in the second year, all of them at dusk, all of them within 30 meters of each other. I set the second lure at a creek crossing where the bone meal in the soil was thickest. I set the third lure at the entrance to a depression in the ground that the survey skimmer had mapped as a thermal anomaly, which Asha believed was the den. I did not arm the lures. I left them cold. I wanted the warden to find them first as objects, and then to find them later as heat, and to learn in the interval that objects in its forest could become heat without warning, and to be uncertain. Uncertainty is a thing predators have not been bred to tolerate. Then I anchored the tether at the root tower and walked the cable out and laid it under the leaf mold along a line I had drawn on Asha's map in red ink. The line ended at a clearing I had chosen because the canopy above it was thin, enough to let the moonlight in, and because the clearing was bounded on 3 sides by Vex stonework that the warden could not approach without being fully silhouetted. The 4th side was open, and that was the side I would face. I cuffed the tether to my wrist. I sat down on a flat stone at the open edge of the clearing with my back to the stonework and my rifle across my knees, and I waited. I waited from afternoon into evening, and from evening into night, and from night into the long, blue hour before dawn, when the forest holds its breath. The first lure activated at the time I had set, 2 hours after dark, 3 kilometers to the north. The second activated 40 minutes later, 2 kilometers to the east. The third activated an hour after that, deep in the den ground, and through my scope I saw, very far away, the faint white bloom of its heat against the cold pixels of the trees. The warden ran. I cannot describe to you how a thing that size runs. The closest I can come is to say that it does not so much move through space as seeds space briefly before reclaiming it. I saw the white bloom of the third lure flicker. That was the warden arriving, and then go out. That was the warden, finding nothing, knocking the lure apart. Then the second lure went out, also too soon. Then the first, 3 kills. Each one further from me. Each one a place where it had expected meat and found instead a chemical mock. By the time the first lure was extinguished, I could feel the warden's anger across 3 kilometers of forest, the way you can feel a storm cell across a county. It had been hunting for 2,000 years. It had not been mocked for any of them. I held very still on my stone, my breath fogged in the cold. I had stopped sweating an hour earlier. Asha's last gift to me had been a patch on the small of my back, a slow-release drug that suppressed adrenal sweat, because the warden read salt in the air the way a shark reads blood in water. I sat in the clearing and I let my heat be the only heat for a kilometer in any direction, and the warden, having found 3 false fires, turned its head toward the true one. It came in slowly. That was the first surprise. I had expected speed. I got patience. It moved through the trees at the pace of a man walking, and I watched the heat bloom of it on my scope grow from a smudge to a shape, and then I lowered the scope because I wanted to see it with my own eyes when it came into the clearing. It came into the clearing. Moonlight does strange things to a creature like that. Up close in the dark, it was less like a dog than I had remembered, and more like a question the universe had asked, and then refused to answer. It stood at the edge of the open side of the clearing, and its head turned slightly, and the thermal pits along its brow opened and closed in a slow rhythm, like the slats of a Venetian blind reading me. I sat very still. I did not raise the rifle. The rifle at this range was an insult to the rifle. The warden took 1 step into the clearing. I said, "I know what you are." I do not know if it understood the words. I think it understood the sound. The pits along its brow stopped moving for a moment, and then resumed, and the head tilted, in a small precise gesture that was so close to a dog's curiosity that I felt a kind of grief go through me, that something this old and this terrible should still gesture with the shape of a dog. I said, "You've been here a long time. You've earned every kill. I'm not here to take that from you. It took another step, I said. I'm here because you took my neighbors. I'm here because you took a child whose name was Eli. I'm here because the coalition won't come and the wall doesn't work and the only person on this planet who's stupid enough to sit in this clearing and talk to you is me. It took another step. I lifted the rifle, not to shoot, to show. I held it across my body sideways so it could see what I had, and what I had was not very much. It was an old hunting rifle, a 12mm bore, with a wooden stock my father had carved before I was born. The warden looked at the rifle. The warden looked at me. The pits along its brow read the heat of my hands on the wood, and the heat of my breath in the cold air, and the heat of my heart was beating very fast, but had not yet broken into a runaway. It was reading me the way a man reads a book he has been told is dangerous, I said. I built you a trap. The lures were the trap, you know that now. It made a sound. The sound was not a growl. It was lower than a growl, and longer, and it had structure. It rose and fell in pitch, and there were 4 discrete pulses to it, and on the 4th pulse the warden lowered its head, and the muscles along its shoulders banked the way a furnace banks before a surge. I said, "Wait." The warden did not wait. The warden charged. I will tell you what saved me, and it will sound stupid, and it is stupid, and it is also the only thing that worked. I had spent 6 years walking through Pell's Crossing and watching the warden hunt, by proxy, through the bodies it left behind. I had read every survey report. I had read every translated fragment Asha could put in my hands. I had stared at the photographs of the kill sites until I could close my eyes and see them. And I had noticed, and I had not been able to make myself stop noticing, that in every kill, the warden struck from the prey's right side, every single one. The Brennan steer had been opened on the right flank. Father Helio's body had been carried with the right shoulder forward. The Petrov twins had been taken from the right of the barn door. Even Eli Brennan, who had survived because he had been on the left of his father when the strike came, and his father had been the one the warden had taken. The Vex texts had a word for it. Asha had translated it 3 weeks before I went into the woods. The word was something like favoring. The wardens had been bred to engage Vex prey, and Vex prey had a vulnerable organ on the left side of the body, and the wardens had been engineered with a strong rightward strike preference, because that put their jaws across the Vex left flank. The preference had been hard-coded. 2,000 years had not bred it out. The warden coming for me would come from my right. I had sat on the flat stone with the rifle across my knees and the open side of the clearing on my left. The warden charged from my right because it could do nothing else, and as it came I rolled left off the stone and into the moonlit gap I had left for myself, and the warden's jaws closed on the empty stone, and on the rifle I had abandoned there, and on the wooden stock my father had carved, and the carving went into pieces in its mouth, came up off my left shoulder, with the cuff still on my wrist, and the cable still in the leaf mold, and a thing in my left hand that I had not, until this moment named. It was a Vex blade. Asha had found it at a dig 3 years before, and had kept it on the mantle, because we had not known what else to do with it. The blade was not metal. The blade was a kind of vitrified ceramic, the color of old ice, and it was as long as my forearm, and the edge of it was molecular. The Vex had ground it down to a single layer of atoms, and the layers survived 2,000 years because the Vex had been very good at survival, in the limited sense that their tools had outlived them. The warden turned. The pits along its brow read, the heat in my arm and the heat in the blade, and could not, perhaps, tell the difference. Came again. It came again from my right, because that was how it had been built. I went under the strike. I went under it because I had walked through the clearing 30 times in daylight rehearsing the exact angle of the duck, because the cuff on my wrist had taken up 1/2 meter of tether slack, and because the warden was not, in the end, accustomed to prey that had read its instruction manual. I went under the strike, and I came up with the Vex blade in both hands, and I drove it in. The vent on the underside of its chest, the heat vent, the one Asha had said no one had ever seen, because no one who got close enough had lived. The blade went into the hilt. The warden screamed. I have heard men scream. I have heard women in labor. I have heard a steer die in a slaughterhouse, and I have heard a dog die under a wagon wheel. I had not heard, until that night, a thing 2,000 years old, understand that it was going to be the last of its kind. The scream came out of the throat I had not known it had, and the throat shaped the sound the way a horn shapes a note, and the note went up into the canopy of the sunken wood and rolled out across the cold air for a kilometer in every direction. In the village, Asha told me later, the dogs in every yard sat up at the same moment and faced the woods and would not move for an hour. The warden fell sideways. It fell slowly. It did not thrash. It lay on its side with the blade still in its chest and its long head turned toward me, and the pits along its brow opened, of them at once, and read me one last time. I knelt down. I did not know why. I knelt down beside it the way a man kneels beside a dying horse, because the horse has carried him a long way and is owed the courtesy. The pits closed. The warden made the four-pulse sound again, very softly, and I understood. I understand it now, and I understood it then, in a way I cannot defend, that the sound was a name, its own. The thing was telling me what it had been called, when it had been called anything, by the Vex who had bred it and abandoned it and left it here. 2,000 years it had been waiting to say its own name to something that would hear it, I said. I hear you. The warden's chest stopped. I sat for a long time in the clearing. I did not know what time it was. The moon had moved. The cold had deepened. There was blood on my hands and on the front of my coat and in my hair, where it had come down from the blade as I drove it in, and the blood was not red. It was a dark, dark blue, almost black, and it smelled of iron and of something else, something like cedar smoke. And I did not understand the smell, and I never have. I uncuffed myself. I left the cable. I left the rifle, what was left of it, picked up the Vex blade and wiped it on my coat, and I put it in my belt. I walked over to the warden and I looked at it for a long time. I did not know what to do with the body. I did not have the strength to drag it. I did not have the wood to burn it. I did not have the words to bury it. So I did the only thing I could think of, which was the small thing I had been taught by my mother, who had grown up in a country where they buried their dead under cairns, because the ground was too hard to dig. I gathered stones from the Vex stonework at the edges of the clearing, small ones, the size of a fist, and I built a cairn on the warden's chest, around the hilt of the blade, until the cairn was as high as my knee. I worked until the first gray of dawn was in the canopy and the cold was in my hands and I could no longer feel my fingers on the stones. When the cairn was done, I stood beside it, and I hummed my mother's tune one more time. Feek, the slow 4 notes in a minor key, and the sound went up into the trees and stayed there for a moment before it faded. Shh! And I do not know if anything heard it, and I do not know if anything was left to hear. But I hummed it through anyway. Because the thing under the stones had been alone for 2,000 years, and I did not want it to be alone for the first morning. Then I walked out of the sunken wood. The walk took me 2 days. I do not remember most of it. I remember the tree line. I remember Asha at the tree line. I do not know how she knew when to be there, but she was there, and Eerie was beside her, holding the carving she had made of me with the pole over my shoulder. And I came out of the woods, and I did not have a pole. I had a Vex blade in my belt, and a cairn at my back, and a sound in my head that I will hear until I die, which is the sound of a thing 2,000 years old, saying its own name to the only person who would ever hear it. Eerie ran to me. She did not say anything. She put her arms around my legs and held on, and I could not pick her up, because my hands were not working, and Asha came up behind her and put her hand on my face and did not speak either. After a while, Eerie looked up at me. She said, "Did you take it apart, Papa?" I said, "Yes, sweetheart," she said. "Was it tired at the end?" I said, "Yes, we both were." She said, "Were you smarter than it?" I thought about this. I thought about it for a long time. I thought about the way the warden had stood at the edge of the clearing and tilted its head like a dog, and about the 4-pulse name it had said, and about the cairn I had built with stones that the Vex had cut. And I said, "No, sweetheart, it was smarter than me. I was just more stubborn." He nodded. She filed that away too. The coalition came 6 weeks later, when word of the kill had finally crawled up the chain to someone who cared. They sent a team of scientists who wanted the body, and a team of lawyers who wanted the blade. I gave them the location of the cairn. I would not give them the blade. The lawyers got loud about it, and Asha came out on the porch with the small fragment of Vex husbandry text she had been working on for 6 years, and she said, in the calm voice she used for animals and for fools, that the Vex had a word for the thing that killed a warden. and the word translated as successor. And the successor's blade was, by Vex tradition, a personal object that could not be transferred, and that any attempt to transfer it would render the kill null in Vex law, and that since the Coalition had spent 2 decades insisting that Vex law governed this planet's residual biological assets, perhaps the Coalition would like to revisit its position. The lawyers went away. The scientists found the cairn. They photographed it. They asked permission to disassemble it. I said no. They asked again in a longer letter, and Asha drafted a longer reply, and that was the end of it. As far as I know, the cairn is still there. As far as I know, the blade is still in it, under the stones, because I went back 6 months later, and I put it there, because the thing under the cairn was owed a blade as much as it was owed a name. I kept Erie's carving. I keep it in my pocket. The little wooden man with the pole over his shoulder walking home. The colony is up to 1,800 souls now. Had a good harvest last year, and a better one this year. The wall has come down in 3 places, because we do not need it anymore. And the children play in the meadow that used to be the kill ground at the edge of the sunken wood. And once in a while, one of them will come back from the meadow and say they heard a long, low sound in the trees. A 4-pulse sound, and I tell them that the wind makes strange noises out here, and I send them home with bread. I do not believe it is the wind. I believe that the Vex bred their wardens to remember, and that what is remembered does not entirely die, and that somewhere in the sunken wood, in a clearing under a cairn, a thing 2,000 years old is still saying its name, very softly, into the cold, in case some other stubborn animal happens to be passing by and is willing to listen. I listen when the wind is right. I am, as my daughter said, stubborn man. That is the only thing that saved us. Not the rifle which broke, not the lures, fooled the warden for 10 minutes and no longer. Not the blade which any fool could have driven in if he'd known where to drive it. What saved us was sitting at a kitchen table with a woman who knew more than I did and listening to her. Saved us was a 7-year-old who carved a man with a pole over his shoulder because she had decided that was what coming home looked like. What saved us was a colony of 1,141 people who did not leave, because there was nowhere to go, who therefore had to make this place into a place worth staying. The Coalition wrote up the kill, eventually. They classified it. In a file, the file said, Warden, single individual Theris Forth, terminated by colonial action, method unclear. The method was not unclear. The method was a kitchen table and a wooden carving, and a woman who could read a dead language and a man who was too stubborn to be reasonable. The method was us. If you are out there, on some other mercy, with some other thing in the woods that the Coalition will not come for and the wall will not stop. If you are wondering what to do about it, I tell you what we learned, and you may take it or leave it. The thing in the woods is older than you. It is stronger than you. It is smarter than you in every measurable way. It has been hunting on its ground for longer than your species has had a written language. It will come from your right side, or it will come from above, or it will come from the place you did not think to look. And it will be patient, and it will not be fooled twice. It will be fooled once. That is all you need. You do not need to be smarter than the thing. You need to be more stubborn. You need to sit at the kitchen table when everyone is telling you to leave, and you need to read the small print, and you need to listen to the person across from you who knows more than you do, and you need to build the small obsessive things that nobody else thinks will matter, and you need to walk into the woods knowing you will not walk out the way you walked in. And when the thing comes, and it will come, from your right, because that is how it was built, you need to be already moving the other way. That is the human thing. That is the thing we have, that the wardens were not bred for, and the Vex did not anticipate, and the Coalition does not classify, because it does not fit in the file. The thing we have is that we will not leave. We will not be reasonable. We will sit on a stone in a clearing in a forest that has killed everyone else who sat there, and we will wait, and when the thing comes we will go under the strike, and we will drive a blade into the place no one has ever seen, and we will build a cairn over what we have killed, because what we have killed is owed that much, and then we will walk home. Erie is 12 now. She still carves. She is better at it than I am. Last week she gave me a new figure of a woman with her hand on a man's face, and I did not have to ask who it was. I keep it on the mantel, next to the empty space where the Vex blade used to lie. The space is empty because the blade is where it belongs. Carving is on the mantel because we are where we belong. The forest is quiet most nights. Most nights, that is enough. There is one more thing. Last spring, a freighter put down at our little port, and an old coalition biologist came off it. The same one who had signed the report telling us to abandon Pell's Crossing 9 years before. He was a small man, neat, with the careful hands of a person who had spent a career labeling things in jars. He came to the constable's office, which is to say my office, which is to say my kitchen, and he sat at our table with his coat folded over his knees. And he said he had come to apologize. I told him an apology was not needed. He said it was needed by him, if not by us. He said he had been thinking about the file, the one with the classified report, and the line about a warden terminated by colonial action, method unclear. He said the file had been bothering him for years. He said he had come to ask, off the record, how we had done it. Asha looked at me. I looked at Asha. Erie, who was 12 and had opinions, looked at both of us from the doorway, where she had been listening, because she has her mother's habits. I said to the biologist, "Do you want the long answer or the short one?" He said, "The honest one." I said, "The honest answer is that we read your file, and we read the small print, and we read the Vex texts that your translators got wrong, and we did not leave. The thing was older than us and stronger than us and smarter than us, and we did not leave. That is the answer. That is all of it." He sat with that for a while. He drank his tea. He said finally, "I have spent 40 years studying the Vex. I have spent 40 years telling colonial boards that some places cannot be settled. I have been right, most of the time. I was wrong about you." Ed. "You weren't wrong. You were just early." He looked up, I said. "If you had come here in the second year, you would have been right. We would have left. The thing would have won. You wrote the report at the right time, with the right information, and you would have been right except for one thing you couldn't have known about," he said. "What was that?" I said. He left on the same freighter 3 days later. He took with him a copy of Asha's translations and a small wooden carving Erie had given him, a man with a pole over his shoulder walking home, except this one was a smaller version, because Erie had been 12, not 7, and her hands had grown more careful, and the carving had 2 figures now, the man and a woman with her hand on his face, both of them walking. He said he would keep them on his desk. I believe he did. I think about him sometimes. I think about all the small offices in all the small coalition buildings on all the worlds we have not yet settled, full of careful men writing careful reports about which places cannot be lived in. I think about the small print at the bottom of those reports, and the small obsessive things that the small print does not anticipate. I think about kitchen tables on 1,000 other mercies, where some other stubborn animal is sitting across from some other woman who knows more than he does, and reading. I hope they keep reading. Hope they do not leave.